At 74 years old, Harriet Voss had given 41 years of her life to other people's children and 30 years of that same life to two of her own grandchildren after their father walked out and their mother stopped being able to hold things together. She had never once asked to be thanked. She had only asked at the end for the one thing she believed no one could take from her, the right to stay in the home she had lived in for 31 years. On a Tuesday night in November, sitting at a kitchen table she had owned since 1993, she learned that even that had already been signed away without her full knowledge, without her real consent. And the only thing left in her name was a rusted key to a house in Vermont that her family had laughed at for 15 years. What they did not know, what Wade Prentice and Fletcher Voss, with all their spreadsheets and settlement offers, could not have calculated, was what Mabel Oakes had been protecting inside that house since before Harriet was old enough to understand why some things need protecting. Before we get into the full story, tell us where you are watching from right now. And if this is already hitting close to home, go ahead and subscribe, because what is waiting in the next part of this story is something you are not going to want to miss. The kitchen in Harriet's apartment on Sedgwick Street in Jamaica Plain, Boston, was not a large kitchen. It had never needed to be. After her husband passed in 1991, she had lived there alone, except for the years Fletcher and Nora had stayed with her. Those had been full years, loud years, years when the refrigerator was always running low and someone was always leaving a backpack on the floor by the door. The kitchen had held all of it. The table, a solid maple piece she had bought secondhand from a teacher who was moving to Connecticut, had 4 chairs around it, though only one was ever pulled out in recent years. The surface was clean and worn in equal measure. There was a small crack along the left edge where Fletcher had backed a bicycle into it when he was 9 years old. He had been so afraid to tell her. She had never mentioned it to him, just sanded it smooth and sealed it with a little wood filler and let it become part of the table. That was the kind of thing Harriet Voss noticed and kept to herself. On the wall beside the refrigerator, pinned with a small magnet shaped like the state of Massachusetts, was a piece of paper with a short poem written in her own handwriting. She had written it for a class in 1998 and had liked it enough to keep it. The students had not understood it at the time. They were 11 years old. But 2 of them had come back years later and told her they had looked it up, had memorized it, had read it at their own children's bedtime. That was the reward Harriet understood. Not ceremonies or framed certificates. The thing that traveled forward without you. Fletcher arrived at 6:30 that Tuesday evening. Harriet heard his key in the lock before she heard him knock, which told her something. He came in wearing his jacket zipped all the way to the collar, as if he had no plans to stay long enough to take it off. He was 34 years old, with the kind of face that looked permanently just behind on sleep, and he had his father's habit of letting his eyes move around a room before he made eye contact with anyone in it. He sat down across from her. Nora came in behind him and walked to the window and stood there with her phone screen dark in her hand. She was 29 and quieter than Fletcher, in the way that still water is quieter than moving water, which is not always the same as being calm. Fletcher set a folder on the table. It was the kind of folder you buy in bulk from an office supply store. Blue cardboard, brass fastener, the kind that holds paper in place without committing too firmly to anything. He pushed it toward Harriet and said they needed to settle something. He said the sooner the better. He said they could wrap it all up without any fuss. Harriet looked at the folder. She did not open it. She looked at Fletcher instead, the way she had looked at students who had come to her with wrong answers they believed in completely. Not unkindly, just steadily. She said she would like to know in his own words what they were settling. Fletcher exhaled slowly. He explained that the cafe had closed. Not temporarily, not a pause for restructuring. Closed. The last creditor had filed, and there was a balance that had to be addressed. The apartment, the one Harriet was sitting in, had been used as collateral when the financing was arranged 3 years earlier. She had signed papers at the time. She had understood the general shape of what she was agreeing to, he said. And now the bank was sending notices, and the cleanest path forward was to agree to a sale, settle the outstanding balance, and let Harriet find something smaller, something more manageable, somewhere easier for a woman her age to maintain. He said the last part gently. That was the word he would have used. Gently. Harriet let the silence sit for a moment after he finished speaking. She looked at Nora by the window. Nora was still looking at her phone, though the screen was still dark. Harriet asked Fletcher one question. She asked whether, when he had arranged the financing 3 years ago, and brought papers to the same table for her to sign. He had read her every clause in clear language, or whether he had pointed to a line and waited. Fletcher said it was not the time to go back over that. Harriet said she was not going back over anything. She was establishing context. Fletcher pushed the pen toward her. The pen was a cheap ballpoint, the kind that comes in a box of 20 blue ink transparent barrel. Harriet looked at it the way you look at something that has been placed in your field of vision as a test. She said she needed to read the documents first. Fletcher said there was really nothing in them that required much reading. It was all standard. Harriet said she needed to read them first. There was a quality in her voice when she said it the second time that Fletcher registered without fully understanding. He looked at Nora. Nora looked at the windowsill where a small empty planter sat in a dry saucer. She had not spoken since she came in. Fletcher said Fine read them, but the deadline was the 15th, 2 weeks. He stood up and went to the hall to make a phone call. Nora stayed by the window. Harriet picked up the folder. She carried it to her room. The bedroom was small and orderly. The bed was made with a pale blue quilt Harriet had bought at a church sale in 2004. On the nightstand was a glass of water, a small lamp, and a book with a cracked spine and penciled notes in the margins that she had been keeping by her bed for 30 years, not always reading, but always near. She sat on the edge of the mattress and put on her reading glasses and opened the folder. She read slowly. This was not because she read slowly. Harriet Voss had spent 4 decades teaching children how to read, how to find the real sentence inside the official sentence, how to notice what a text was hiding by noticing what it was working hard to explain. She read slowly because speed was not what the situation required. The first thing she found was not surprising. The mortgage documentation confirmed what Fletcher had described. The apartment had been used as security on a business loan. The loan had defaulted. A sale of the property was the proposed resolution. The second thing stopped her. There was a clause she had not been told about in simple terms. If Harriet signed the specific document flagged with the yellow tab before December the 15th, ownership of the property would transfer to an LLC called Millbridge Holdings. Harriet had never heard that name. She turned the pages looking for a reference to who stood behind that LLC. There was none in the main documents. She found it in what had slipped loose between 2 of the pages toward the back of the folder. It was a printed email, 1 page folded once. It had not been meant to be included. She could tell because it had no cover sheet, no explanation, no context of any kind. It had simply traveled from wherever Fletcher kept his papers into this folder and arrived at her kitchen table and into her hands. The email was addressed to Fletcher. The sender was identified as Wade Prentice, with a title line that read Managing Director, Prentice and Partners Development Group, Burlington, Vermont. The date on the email was 3 weeks earlier. Harriet read it twice. In the email, Prentice thanked Fletcher for confirming the timeline. He referred to the property in Jamaica Plain as the primary leverage instrument. And then in the second paragraph, he asked Fletcher to clarify one detail about what he called the Gray Mill parcel, specifically how the Mill Pond Road property fit into the full site acquisition for the lakefront development phase. Harriet sat still for a long time after she finished reading. Mill Pond Road. The name did not arrive in her mind as geography. It arrived as a smell. Old wood and cold water, and the sound of a screen door that never latched properly. It arrived as the memory of a summer afternoon in 1970 when she was 18 years old and had spent 3 weeks in a small Vermont village with a woman the family called eccentric, which was the word they used for people they did not want to take the time to understand. Harriet set the email down on the quilt beside her. She took off her glasses and pressed her fingers against her closed eyes for a moment. Then she opened the nightstand drawer. She moved aside a small bottle of aspirin, a pocket calendar from 2021, a folded letter from her husband that she had not been able to bring herself to throw away after 33 years. And beneath all of that, in the back corner of the drawer, is a brown envelope. The paper was soft with age. The postmark in the corner read, Vermont 2009. She did not need to open it to know what was inside. She had put it there the week after it arrived when Fletcher was 18, and had looked at it and said what he said, and she had not had the energy to argue with an 18-year-old about the value of a house he had never seen. She opened it now. Inside was a letter from an attorney's office in Burlington. It informed Harriet Voss that Mabel Rose Oaks of 14 Mill Pond Road, Gray Mill, Vermont, had passed away in the spring of 2009, and that per the terms of her last will and testament, the property at 14 Mill Pond Road was bequeathed in full to her great-niece Harriet Voss of Boston, Massachusetts. The assessed value of the property was listed as nominal. The letter noted that the property had not been occupied in several years and would require attention from the new owner. Harriet held the letter and felt the particular weight of something she had set aside and forgotten, and now found again in the same week someone else had remembered it for her and for entirely different reasons. At the bottom of the envelope, she felt something small and hard. She tilted it and let it fall into her palm. A key. Old iron, longer than a house key, with a simple arch at the top and a single notched bit at the bottom. No tag, no label, no explanation. Just the key itself, dark from years of handling, and then dark again from years of no handling at all. Harriet closed her fingers around it. She sat there for a long time with the key in one hand and the email from Prentice in the other. From the hallway, she could hear Fletcher's voice, low and controlled, the voice he used when he was negotiating. From the living room, she heard nothing from Nora at all. The pen was still on the kitchen table. She had not touched it. In the morning, Fletcher had gone before breakfast. He had left without eating, without leaving a note. Nora was in the small bedroom that had been Nora's bedroom for 4 years when she was in high school, and she was either sleeping or pretending to sleep. Harriet made coffee and sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at the folder and the pen, which had not moved from where Fletcher placed them the night before. She picked up the pen and turned it over once in her fingers. Then she put it in the kitchen drawer, the second one down, the one where she kept rubber bands and spare batteries and the small tools that did not belong to any specific category. She pushed the drawer closed. She was not throwing the pen away. She was simply not leaving it out. When Nora came into the kitchen an hour later, Harriet had the blue folder open in front of her and the email from Prentice set to one side. She did not give Nora time to pour coffee before she asked her to sit down. Nora sat. Harriet placed the printed email on the table between them. She asked Nora whether she recognized the name Wade Prentice. Nora looked at the email. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been hoping not to encounter in a particular context. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. Then Nora said yes. She said she had met him about 2 months earlier at Fletcher's office. She had been dropping something off, and Prentice had been there, and Fletcher had introduced them. They had exchanged maybe 10 words. Harriet asked what Prentice had said in those 10 words. Nora said he had mentioned that the Gray Mill project was coming together nicely and that the lakefront piece was the key to the whole thing. She said she had not known what Gray Mill was. She had asked Fletcher after Prentice left. Fletcher had said it was a development he was keeping an eye on, nothing Harriet needed to know about. Harriet looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Nora was 29 years old and had a good heart that she consistently placed at the service of whoever was in the room with her and asking for something. That was not the same as having a strong character. Harriet had understood this about Nora for years, and she had thought of it as a softness that time would harden. Sitting across from her now, she thought perhaps time was not the right teacher for that particular lesson. She asked Nora why she had not told her. Nora said she had thought it would cause a fight between Harriet and Fletcher. She said she had thought if she stayed out of it, things would sort themselves out. She said she had been wrong. Harriet said yes, she had been. The sentence was not delivered as punishment. It was delivered as fact, the way Harriet had always tried to deliver corrections in the classroom, gently and without decoration. Fletcher came back shortly after 10 in the morning. He had coffee from a place down the street, and he put one in front of Harriet without asking. He sat down and looked at both of them and seemed to register from the quality of the silence that something had shifted while he was gone. He said they should try to get this resolved today. Harriet said she was not going to sign anything today. Fletcher said he understood she needed time, but that time was the one thing they did not have in abundance at the moment. Harriet said she understood his situation. She said she had read the documents carefully. She said she had questions about an LLC called Millbridge Holdings that she had not been able to find in any public filings, and she had questions about a person named Wade Prentice in a piece of property in Vermont that she was quite certain she had never agreed to discuss with any developer. Fletcher's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, the way a person looks when a conversation they believe they were managing has started to move in a direction they did not prepare for. He said the Vermont property was a separate matter. Harriet said the email in the folder she was looking at suggested it was not. Fletcher said the email had ended up in there by mistake. Harriet said she understood. She folded the email and placed it inside the cover of the book on her nightstand with the book's worn spine facing outward, and she returned to the kitchen and stood in the doorway. She said she was going to take a few days to think. Fletcher said the deadline was December the 15th. He said it again as if she had not heard him the first 3 times. He said there would be consequences if the deadline passed without a resolution. Harriet said she had been teaching children for 41 years about what happened when you made a decision quickly because someone told you there was no time. She said the children who rushed through their exams almost never got the highest marks. Fletcher looked at his coffee. Nora looked at her hands. Harriet went to her room and took the small travel bag from the top shelf of her closet and began to pack it quietly and methodically. A change of clothes, her toiletries in the small zip case she had carried since the early 90s, the folder with her own documents, her passport and health card, and the papers she kept in the bottom drawer, the old envelope from Vermont, and the book from her nightstand with the pencil marks in the margins which she placed on top of everything else before zipping the bag. She walked back through the kitchen without stopping. The folder Fletcher had brought was still on the table. The pen was in the drawer. She paused at the door and looked back at Fletcher. She said the 15th was still several days away. Then she let herself out and pulled the door gently closed behind her the way she had always closed it when she left early in the morning for school, so as not to wake the children. And she walked down the 2 flights of stairs and out into the November air. The Greyhound station at South Station was a 20-minute walk. Harriet walked it without hurrying. She bought a ticket to Burlington, Vermont with cash from the envelope she kept in the inside pocket of her coat, the same envelope she had kept there since the mid-90s, when Fletcher had been old enough to learn that sometimes you needed money that did not have a record. She paid for the ticket and found a seat near the middle of the bus, away from the engine noise and away from the draft at the back, and she placed her bag on her lap and waited. The bus pulled out at 7 minutes past 9. Harriet watched Boston slide away through the smudged window, the familiar neighborhoods becoming less familiar and then unfamiliar, and then entirely other, the way a life looks when you start to move away from its center. She opened her phone and scrolled through the contacts. Fletcher, Nora, a clinic, a pharmacy, a maintenance line. One colleague from school who had moved to Phoenix in 2018 and with whom she still exchanged Christmas cards. She closed the phone. She did not feel sorry for herself about what she saw there. She noted it carefully without drama as information. She opened the Maps application on her phone and typed the address from the old attorney's letter into the search bar. 14 Mill Pond Road, Gray Mill, Vermont. The map found it. A small dot at the edge of a village near a body of water labeled Mill Pond. She switched to Street View. The image that loaded was from 2011, 15 years ago. The photograph showed a narrow road lined with bare trees, and at the end of a short gravel drive, a white clapboard house with a wide front porch and shutters that needed painting. The image was slightly blurred in the way that old street view photographs often were, as if the camera had moved at the exact wrong moment and caught the world mid-breath. Harriet studied the photograph for a long time. The house was smaller than she remembered, but she had last seen it in the summer of 1972, when she was 20 years old and the world had the magnified quality of early adulthood, when everything large and old looks larger and older still. She had spent one summer there as a child in 1967 and come back for a week at 18 and again at 20. After that, life had moved in the direction lives tend to move forward and away, and the White House near the water had stayed where it was, behind a gate she had not thought to return to. She sat with the question of why for a few miles, watching the landscape outside the window change from suburb to open road, and she had no clean answer. The family had not encouraged returning. The family had called Mabel's world small and cluttered and eccentric, and Harriet had been young enough to accept that description without checking it against her own memory. She put her phone face down on her knee. After a while, she took the book from her bag and held it in her lap without opening it. The cover was worn smooth along the edges from decades of being picked up and set down. The spine had been repaired twice with tape. Inside in pencil, in a younger version of her own handwriting, notes covered the margins of nearly every page. Underlined passages, questions, small disagreements written out in the shorthand she had used her whole teaching life. She had carried this book to school for years. She had used passages from it in class. She had written the title on the board more than once when she wanted students to understand something about the relationship between a reader and a text. She could no longer remember where she had gotten it. That small gap in memory which had never troubled her before pressed against her now in the quiet of the moving bus. Where had this book come from? She had owned it so long, it felt like it had always been hers, like it had arrived with her into the world. But books did not do that. Books had origins. Someone had given it to her, or she had bought it somewhere, or it had been left behind by someone else and she had claimed it. She pressed her palm flat against the cover and felt the old cloth beneath her hand and did not reach any answer, and after a while she stopped trying and watched Vermont come toward her through the window instead. The bus stopped in Burlington at 2:30 in the afternoon. Harriet got off and stood for a moment outside the terminal with her bag and the cold air off the lake moving through her coat. She asked a woman loading packages into a van whether she happened to know the road to Graymill. The woman said it was about 40 minutes east, that the last bus out that way had already run for the day. She said she was going close to there herself if Harriet wanted a ride. She just had to wait about 20 minutes while she finished her deliveries. Harriet said she was grateful. She waited. They drove mostly in silence, which suited Harriet fine. The woman, whose name was Barb and who ran some kind of regional delivery route, did not ask many questions and did not seem to require conversation. She dropped Harriet at the edge of Gray Mill's main road just before 4 o'clock, pointed her in the general direction of the village center, and drove on. Gray Mill was a Vermont village in the way that some places are exactly what their names suggest, and no more and no less. There was a white church with a weather vane at the top that needed straightening. There was a general store with a hand-painted sign and firewood stacked to one side of the entrance. There was a library in a low building with a painted porch and 3 tall windows and a small parking area in front of it with 1 truck in it. The street was quiet, the way streets in small places are quiet in November. Not empty exactly, but removed as if the town had drawn in its edges for the cold months and was waiting. Harriet stood on the main road with her bag over her shoulder and let her eyes adjust to the scale of the place. She was not a woman who had spent much time in small towns. Boston had been her world for 40 years, but there was something in this particular quiet that felt less like absence and more like held breath. A man came out of the hardware store to her left, pulling on a pair of work gloves. He was in his early 70s, solid-built, white-haired, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who had run something for a long time and recently handed it off to someone else. He looked at Harriet with the frank curiosity of a person who knows everyone in a town and therefore knows immediately when someone new has arrived. He said hello. He asked if she was looking for something in particular. Harriet said she was looking for Mill Pond Road. The man's expression shifted in a way that was barely visible, but not invisible to someone who had spent 4 decades reading the faces of people, deciding what they were going to say. He said his name was Leland Fitch. He said he had served as mayor of Graymill for 18 years before stepping down 2 years ago. He said he knew Mill Pond Road, and he knew the house at the end of it, and if she did not mind him asking, was she the woman who owned it? Harriet said she was, or at least she was the person whose name was on the paperwork. Leland said that was interesting because about 3 months back, a man had come to Graymill claiming to represent the owner of that property and had presented himself to the town's planning and zoning board as someone authorized to discuss the property's disposition on behalf of the owner. Harriet looked at him steadily. She asked who this man was. Leland said his name was Wade Prentice from a development company in Burlington. He said Prentice had been trying to assemble a parcel of land along the Mill Pond water frontage for a private resort and recreation project, and that 14 Mill Pond Road was the centerpiece of the whole assembly. Without it, the project did not have the lakefront access the investors needed. Prentice had been working the surrounding parcels for months, had gotten commitments on some of them, and had come to the planning board presenting the 14 Mill Pond Road acquisition as effectively concluded pending final paperwork from the owner. Harriet said she had never authorized anyone to represent her in those discussions. Leland said that was what he had begun to suspect when the paperwork Prentice promised to produce had not arrived. He said the board had tabled the application pending documentation. He said the next board meeting was the following Tuesday. He said he would be honest with her. He said the situation was not resolved. Prentice had not withdrawn his proposal. He was still telling people in Burlington that the project was moving forward. And there had been a second person someone Prentice had referred to as the owner's grandson, who had also made contact with one of the board members by phone saying that the family was in agreement and the paperwork was being handled. Harriet did not look away from Leland's face. She asked whether he had a name for this grandson. Leland said the name the board member had written down was Fletcher Voss. Harriet stood on the main street of Graymill, Vermont, with her overnight bag over her shoulder and the old iron key in her coat pocket, and let that information settle into its proper place among the other things she had learned in the last 24 hours. Fletcher had not simply failed to tell her about Prentice. He had gone further. He had arrived here and her name had spoken in her voice to official bodies, had represented her agreement to a deal she had never discussed, had built the architecture of a transaction around a woman who was sitting in her Boston kitchen, not knowing any of it was happening. Leland watched her face with the expression of a man who has delivered news before and understands that some news needs a moment before a person can respond to it. Harriet said she would like to know how to get to 14 Mill Pond Road. Leland pointed down the main road and told her to take the left fork past the library and follow the path that ran along the south side of the water. He said the gate was iron-rusted, 2 stone posts on either side. He said he did not know what condition the house was in. He said nobody had been inside it in a long time. Harriet thanked him. She shifted her bag on her shoulder and began walking. Behind her, Leland Fitch stood for a moment watching her go. This woman in her 70s walking toward a house that had been locked and waiting for 15 years with a bag over her shoulder and something in her coat pocket that pressed against her side with the slight weight of iron. Then he went back inside. The road to Mill Pond Road was not marked with a sign. Harriet found this out after taking the left fork past the library the way Leland had directed her, and walking a quarter-mile before the pavement ended and the path became packed gravel and then compressed earth, and the trees on either side grew closer together until the lake appeared between them like something that had been there all along and was simply waiting for the right angle of approach. The water was dark in the November afternoon, flat and without wind, and it gave back the sky with the accuracy of something that had been practicing patience for a long time. She walked another 200 yards along the south edge of the water, and then she stopped. The gate was there, 2 stone posts each about 4 feet high, weathered to a color that was neither gray nor brown, but somewhere between the two. Between them, an iron gate that had once been painted black and was now mostly rust, threaded through with the dried stems of a vine that had climbed it in summer and died in place when the cold came. Beyond the gate, a gravel drive led toward a white clapboard house set back from the water. The house was smaller than the street view image had suggested and larger than she remembered from childhood, which meant her memory had compressed it in one direction and the photograph had flattened it in another, and neither had told her the truth about the actual thing standing in front of her. Harriet stood at the gate and looked at the house. The porch was intact. That was the first thing she checked. The roof sagged slightly at the left end but had not given way. 3 of the windows on the ground floor had their shutters still attached and closed. One upstairs window was missing a shutter entirely, the remaining one hanging at an angle like a page half turned. The white paint had peeled back in places to the gray wood beneath, and the wood beneath had darkened from decades of New England weather, but the boards themselves had not rotted through. The house had the particular dignity of something that had been neglected rather than destroyed. There was a difference and it mattered. She looked down. In the mud just inside the gate on the gravel that had shifted over the years, so that the center of the drive was now mostly bare earth. She saw tire tracks. Not old tracks, not the faint impressions of something from months ago. These were recent, the edges still sharp, the compression still visible in the surface of the ground. A vehicle had been here within the last day or two, had pulled up close to the gate, and then reversed and left. Harriet crouched slowly the way a person crouches when their knees are 74 years old and they want to look at something without committing to any sudden movements. She looked at the width of the tracks, a standard vehicle, not a truck. She looked at the depth, not heavy, not a loaded vehicle. Someone had come, had looked, and had gone. She straightened up. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the iron key. She found the lock on the gate, which was hidden under a season's worth of rust and dried vine material, and she worked the key into it slowly. It did not go on the first try. She repositioned her angle and tried again. The second attempt brought the key most of the way in and then stopped. She held the key in place and applied steady pressure without forcing it the way she had learned to do with the warped filing cabinet drawer in her classroom that had jammed every winter for 15 years. The lock gave. The gate opened with a sound that was not a creak so much as a long exhale, as if the iron itself had been holding its breath. Harriet stepped through. The drive was short. She walked it in under 30 seconds and came to the porch steps, 4 of them made of wide pine planks that had grayed and dried but not splintered. She put her weight on the first one carefully. It held. She climbed to the porch. The boards there flexed underfoot but did not shift dangerously. She crossed to the front door, which had a second lock, older and heavier than the gate lock, a mortise type with a large keyhole that the small iron key would not fit. She stepped back from the door and looked at the windows. She was not going to break a window. That was not a thought she entertained. She looked at the door frame that hinges the threshold, and there on the threshold, held in place by a smooth river stone the size of her palm, was a folded piece of paper. She picked it up. The paper was dry, which meant it had been placed there that morning or the day before, not earlier. She unfolded it. On the inside, written in pencil in a large, deliberate hand, were a phone number and a single line: "Call me before you do anything," signed with two initials, WB. Harriet read it twice. She looked back at the tire tracks on the drive. She looked at the phone number. Then she folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket with the key, and she went back to find Ida Hale at the library. The library was warmer inside than the temperature outside would have predicted. Harriet noticed this before she noticed anything else, the particular warmth of a room where people have been sitting and reading for years, and the walls have absorbed it the way walls absorb every kind of accumulated human presence. The shelves ran along three sides. A reading table with 4 chairs sat near the window. Behind a long oak counter at the back, a woman in her late 60s was sorting through a box of returned books with the systematic attention of someone who has been doing this for decades and has reached the point where the work no longer requires thought but still receives it. Her name was Ida Hale. Harriet knew this because it was printed on a small frame card on the counter next to a jar of bookmarks. Ida was compact and efficient-looking, with white hair cut straight across at the jaw and the kind of reading glasses that hang from a cord around the neck, so they are always available without being in the way. She wore a cardigan over a button-down shirt and a woven vest over the cardigan, and she looked like someone who had decided some time ago what she was going to be and had dressed for it ever since. She looked up when Harriet came in. Her expression was polite and assessing in equal measure. She said good afternoon and asked if she could help. Harriet said she was looking for information about the property at 14 Mill Pond Road and that she believed she was the owner. Ida set down the book she was holding. She looked at Harriet with an attention that was different from the standard attention of someone behind a desk. It was the kind of attention that means the person is checking something against something else they already know. She said she would need Harriet to show her some documentation before she could be helpful in that direction. Harriet said she understood completely. She took the brown envelope from her bag and placed it on the counter. The 2009 attorney's letter, the property transfer document, and her own identification, which she placed beside the other papers. Ida examined each item without rushing. She held the attorney's letter at an angle to the window light to read the small print. She checked the name on Harriet's identification against the name on the transfer document and then against the name on the letter. She did all of this without making it feel like an accusation. It was simply procedure, and Harriet respected it. Then Ida looked up from the papers and looked at the bag on Harriet's shoulder and the book held under Harriet's left arm. She said she would like to ask one more question if Harriet did not mind. She asked where Harriet had gotten that particular book. Harriet looked down at the book she had carried from Boston. She said she honestly was not sure. She had owned it for a very long time. A voice came from the far corner of the room. It was a man's voice, low and deliberate, and it said those exact words without any preamble whatsoever. He said that was Dot's book. Harriet turned. In the corner chair, the one positioned at an angle to both the window and the shelves, sat a man who appeared to be in his early 80s. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone from whatever its original color was to a kind of warm gray. His hands resting on the arms of the chair were the hands of someone who had worked with them for 60 years, broad and dense-knuckled, with the particular stillness of hands that know how to be patient because they have had to wait on materials and weather and time for most of their lives. His hair was white and cut short. His face was the face of a man who had seen a considerable amount and had decided that most of it did not require a reaction. He was looking at Harriet with an expression that was not friendly and not unfriendly. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for something to happen and has not yet determined whether this particular something is the right one. Harriet asked if he was WB. He said he was Roscoe Dunbar. He said he had left the note on the threshold that morning after he saw the tire tracks and decided someone was going to be at that house soon, and he wanted to be involved in whatever happened when they got there. Harriet said she appreciated the note. She asked him how he had known to leave it there. He said he had been keeping an eye on that house for 3 months since a man from Burlington had come to town claiming to speak for the owner about selling it. He said he had not believed the story at the time and still did not believe it, but that he had not had a way to address it directly until now. Harriet said she had spoken with Leland Fitch. Roscoe said Leland was a good man who was working within a process. He said processes took time, and meanwhile other things happened. Ida came around from behind the counter and pulled out a chair at the reading table and set it near enough to Roscoe's corner that the three of them formed a loose arrangement. She did not ask Harriet to sit. She simply placed the chair there in a way that made sitting in it the natural next thing to do. Harriet sat. She put the book on the table in front of her. Roscoe looked at it, the worn cover, the repaired spine, the particular way it had been held by many hands over many years. He said he remembered that book. He said Mabel Oakes had used it in her work. He said he would know it anywhere. Harriet looked at him. She said she had been trying to remember where she had gotten it for most of the afternoon. Roscoe said he could not tell her exactly because he had not been there when she received it, but he could tell her when Mabel had used it and with whom and why it looked the way it looked. Harriet said she would like to hear that. Roscoe Dunbar was quiet for a moment, not because he was deciding whether to speak, she thought, more because he was deciding where to begin. He said he had been born in Graymill in 1942. He said he had left school at 12 to help his family and had not gone back. He said he had spent the years between 12 and 29 building things, learning the trade from a man in the next town who did not ask questions about what you had or had not done in a classroom, only whether you showed up on time and paid attention. By 29, he was working on his own. He could read a set of blueprints with accuracy. He could calculate materials and load-bearing specifications in his head faster than most men could do it on paper. He had never had cause to read a novel or a newspaper column and had arranged his life so that the gaps in what he could do never became visible to people who might use them against him. He paused. He looked at his hands. He said there was a contract in 1971, a large one, a civic building, 2 towns over the biggest job he had been offered to that point. There was a clause in the contract he could not parse, not the numbers, the language, a specific paragraph about liability and indemnification that he had read 4 times and could not make his way through. He could not ask the man across the table to explain it, because that man would have known immediately that Roscoe Dunbar, who had been building things in Vermont for 17 years, could not read a legal paragraph. He said a woman in the village told him to go see Mabel Oakes on Mill Pond Road. He said he had not wanted to go. He had stood outside the gate for 10 minutes before he knocked. He said Mabel opened the door and looked at him and said nothing except to come in and sit down. She did not ask him what the problem was. She simply put a book on the table, opened it to the first page, and waited. He said it took 8 months. He went 3 evenings a week. Mabel never told anyone. She never asked him to pay anything. She corrected him without making him feel corrected, which he said was a skill he had not understood until he was much older, when he realized how rarely people possessed it. He said that in March of 1972, he signed his name to the indemnification clause of a building contract, his full name in his own handwriting as a man who had read the document and understood it. He said he was 29 years old. He said in the 47 years after that he had built 47 structures in and around Graymill, the town hall, the fire station annex, the floor of this library, the shelves on the north wall. Each time he signed a contract, he thought briefly of the kitchen table on Mill Pond Road and the woman who had sat across from him 3 evenings a week without making him feel like he owed her anything except the effort of showing up. He said when Mabel passed in 2009, he had gone to the house and stood outside the gate the way he had stood outside it the first time in 1971. He said he had not known what to do. There was no one left in her family that he knew of who understood what the house was. There was no one who was going to protect it from the kind of person who would look at a piece of waterfront property and see only the number it could become. He said he had been managing that problem as best he could for 15 years. He stopped speaking. Harriet had not moved while he talked. She had her hands flat on the table, one on either side of the book, and she had kept her eyes on his face throughout the way she had always kept her eyes on the faces of students who were telling her something important and needed to know they were being received. She said she wanted him to take her through the house. He looked at her. He said he wanted to know one thing first. He said he wanted to know what she intended to do with it. Harriet said she was not going to sell it to Wade Prentice. She said beyond that, she did not have a fixed answer yet, but that she had come here alone on a bus with a bag and a book, and without telling anyone where she was going, and that should tell him something about the direction she was moving in. Roscoe looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, the deliberate rising of a man whose joints require a negotiated approach to vertical, and he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and said to follow him. Ida watched them go with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this particular development and was moderately satisfied by its timing. The walk back to Mill Pond Road was quiet. Roscoe set a pace that was not slow and not fast, a working pace, the pace of someone who has covered ground on foot for most of their life. Harriet matched it without effort. The cold had deepened since the afternoon, and the light was going the sky above the bare trees, turning the color of old pewter. At the gate, Roscoe produced a key from his jacket pocket. Not the same key as Harriet's, a different one, brass rather than iron, which fit the front door lock. He explained that Mabel had given it to him years ago when her hands had started to give her trouble and she needed someone she trusted to handle deliveries when she was unwell. He said he had kept it when she passed, not because he had a right to it, but because he had been the only one who was going to do anything useful with it. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house smelled of old wood and cold air and paper. Not unpleasant, not the smell of abandonment, exactly more the smell of suspension, as if everything inside had simply been waiting at a specific temperature for a specific duration and had not deteriorated so much as paused. Roscoe clicked on a flashlight. He took from his jacket a heavy utility light that threw a wide beam and moved it slowly around the entry hall. The floors were wide plank, pine dusty, but intact. To the left, a front room with a stone fireplace and shelves along two walls, mostly empty, a few books remaining in place like people who had stayed after a party ended. To the right, a narrower room that had been used as a study or workroom, a long wooden table against the far wall, a lamp, two chairs, straight ahead a staircase. Harriet moved through the room slowly. She was not looking for anything specific yet. She was letting the house come back to her, the way places come back to you after a long time, but not all at once, but in fragments, a detail here and a proportion there, until the whole thing assembles itself out of pieces you had forgotten you were carrying. Roscoe pointed out what he had repaired over the years. A section of porch railing he had replaced in 2015, a gutter he had reattached to the roofline, a window in the back room he had resealed against drafts. He said this without pride, as a record of maintenance, the way a craftsman accounts for his time. Harriet stood in the doorway of the front room and looked at the empty shelves. She asked Roscoe where the books had gone. He said Mabel had donated most of them to various places in the months before she died. Libraries, schools, individuals. She wanted to have specific volumes. He said she had been systematic about it, as she was about everything. He said there were things she had not donated, things she had kept in a particular place for a particular reason. Harriet looked at the ceiling. She asked if there was a way to the upper floor. Roscoe led her back to the staircase. He went first, testing each step before putting his weight on it, the habit of a builder who knows what old wood can do. Harriet followed. The steps held. The second floor had two bedrooms and a short hallway, and at the far end of the hallway, a narrow door set into the wall at a slightly lower height than a standard door. The kind of door that announced itself as an entrance to something with a lower ceiling on the other side. Roscoe opened it. The attic ran the full length of the house under the slope of the roof. The beam of the flashlight moved across stacked chairs under dust cloths, a rusted bed frame leaning against the far wall. Cardboard boxes sealed with tape that had dried and let go their tops, now sitting loose rather than fastened. And at the far end against the wall where the roof pitch came down the lowest, a piece of furniture that was different from everything else up there. It was a wooden cabinet, dark-stained, not large, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, with two doors and a center post between them. On the right-hand door, a small padlock, the kind with a short brass shackle, older than anything in any hardware store catalog from the last 20 years. Harriet crossed the attic, carefully stepping around the boxes, ducking slightly where the roof came down. She crouched in front of the cabinet and looked at the padlock. Roscoe held the light steady. She took out her key ring. She still had the keys from the brown envelope, the iron gate key, and 3 others she had not yet tried in anything smaller and more varied, the kind of keys that accumulate in a drawer over decades and outlast the things they once opened. She tried the first, too large. She tried the second, wrong profile entirely. She tried the third, a small brass key with a simple cut, and it went into the lock easily, more easily than any lock had accepted a key in the last 2 days. She turned it. The padlock opened. She held it in her hand for a moment before removing it from the hasp. The attic was very quiet. She could hear Roscoe's breathing behind her and the distant sound of the lake moving against the shore below the house. She opened the cabinet doors. Inside, on 3 shelves, were the things Mabel Oakes had decided were worth locking away. On the top shelf, 3 bound notebooks with gray cardboard covers, the kind sold in school supply stores held together with a cotton cord tied in a bow. On the second shelf, a collection of envelopes organized by size and secured with rubber bands that had dried but not yet cracked. Letters, many of them dozens, maybe more. On the bottom shelf, a small stack of manila folders. And on top of the notebooks, placed there last, and therefore found first, a white envelope. Not aged like the others, not gray or brittle. A plain white envelope, the everyday kind, slightly compressed from being closed within the cabinet for years. On the front of the envelope, written in blue ink in a hand, Harriet recognized from the attorney's letter, from the style of it, if not the specific formation of letters, were 5 words. For Harriet, if she comes. Harriet did not reach for it immediately. She looked at her name written in Mabel Oakes' handwriting, and she thought about the weight of those 5 words. The conditional. Not for Harriet, but for Harriet if she comes. A bequest that knew it might not be claimed. A message written for a specific person without any certainty that the person would ever arrive to receive it. Roscoe said her name quietly just once, not as a direction, just as an acknowledgement that he was there. Harriet lifted the envelope and held it. The paper was cool from the unheated attic. She turned it over. It was sealed the old flap and lick kind, not tampered with, not opened and resealed. She took the notebooks and the envelope downstairs. They sat at the long table in the workroom. Roscoe in the chair to Harriet's right, the flashlight propped against a stack of old magazines, so the beam spread upward and outward and lit the room adequately without being directed at anything specific. Harriet put on her reading glasses and untied the cord on the first notebook and opened it. The handwriting was small and regular, the lines set close together with very little margin wasted. Each entry began with a date and a name, sometimes 2 names, occasionally a note about the weather or the time of day. The entries were short, factual, without sentiment. They read like field notes from someone conducting a long study in which they had decided at the outset that emotion had no place in the record. March 14th, 1962. Agnes T. 3rd session. Can identify all vowels by sight now. Needs more work with consonant clusters. Motivated. Has a granddaughter she wants to write letters to. September 8th, 1966. Peter and Michael H. brothers, ages 11 and 14. School says they are slow. They are not slow. They are missing a foundation. Starting from the beginning again. January 23rd, 1971. Roscoe Dunbar. First session. Knows far more than he has been given credit for. Working at a high level in everything that does not require decoding written text. This will not take as long as he thinks it will. Roscoe had not moved while Harriet read. She glanced at him when she reached his entry. His face had the particular stillness of someone who has known something for 50 years and is hearing it spoken aloud for the first time. She read more pages. The years moved forward. The names changed. The pattern did not. Children whom schools had classified and dismissed. Adults who had spent decades managing around a skill they had never been given. Women who needed to read documents in order to protect themselves from circumstances that had made their reading unnecessary and their vulnerability convenient. Mabel had recorded all of them the same way, in the same steady hand, with the same precise and unsentimental attention. Not their failures, their progress. Harriet stopped on an entry from the summer of 1970. June 12th, 1970. HV, niece visiting for 3 weeks. 18 years old. Bright, perhaps frustrated by not being challenged. Lent her the novel she kept asking about. Told her to read slowly. She seemed impatient with the instruction. We will see. Harriet sat very still. She looked at the initials. She looked at the date. She looked at the word novel. Then she looked at the book on the table beside her, the book she had carried on the bus from Boston, the book with the worn cover and the repaired spine, and the margin notes in pencil in her own younger handwriting. She picked it up and turned to the inside front cover. She had checked this page before years ago and found nothing. But she looked again now under the directed light of the flashlight. There, in the top corner of the page in pencil, so faint she had read it before as a smudge, or a shadow, were 3 letters. MRO, the same initials as the attorney's letter. Mabel Rose Oakes. Harriet put the book down on top of the open notebook. She had owned this book for 54 years. She had taught from it. She had carried it to school and back and across 3 apartments and into the home on Sedgwick Street. She had pressed it to her chest on the bus from Boston because it felt like the only thing she was sure belonged to her. And she had received it at 18 years old from a woman who had looked at a frustrated young woman and lent her something worth keeping. She had spent 54 years teaching children to read slowly and with attention. She had said those exact words. Those exact words, do not rush toward the end, understand the road. She had said it so many times it had become part of how she thought, and she had never once known where it came from. Roscoe said nothing. He looked at the book, and then at Harriet, and then at the table, and he gave her the silence she needed, the way a skilled craftsman gives a material the time it requires to set. When Harriet spoke, her voice was even. She said she had been saying Mabel's words to students for 40 years without knowing they were Mabel's. She said she had apparently learned more from 3 weeks in 1970 than she had understood at the time. Roscoe said Mabel had that effect on people. He said she gave you things you did not know you were receiving and then let you believe they were yours, and in a way they were, once you had made them part of how you thought. Harriet set down the notebook and opened the white envelope. The letter inside was written on 3 sheets of plain white paper, double-sided on the first 2 and single-sided on the third. The handwriting was the same as the notebook entries, slightly larger, slightly less compressed, the handwriting of someone writing for a specific reader rather than for a record. She read it without stopping. Mabel had written it in the spring of 2008, the year before she died. She had written that she did not know if Harriet would ever come. She had written that she had no way of knowing what Harriet's life had become or what shape it would take in the years after Mabel herself was gone. She had written that if Harriet was reading this, the house was still standing and that she was glad. She had written about the house without sentimentality. She said it was not historic. It was not architecturally significant. It was not valuable by any measure a bank or a tax assessor would apply. What it was, she wrote, was a place where a particular kind of work had been done for a long time and where the results of that work were still walking around Graymill and neighboring towns in the bodies of people who could read contracts and write letters and sign their names to things that mattered. She had written about Harriet. She said she had followed Harriet's life from a distance, the way you follow the progress of something you had a small hand in without wanting credit for it. She mentioned the teaching award. She mentioned a letter she had read about a student of Harriet's who had gone on to teach others. She said Harriet had become what she had hoped, someone who taught by listening rather than by telling, which was harder than it sounded and rarer than it should have been. And then the letter changed. Mabel wrote that if Harriet had come to this house because her family had decided she was finished because they had looked at what she represented and found it easier to convert than to honor, she should know that this was not a new story. She wrote that the particular cruelty of being handed a rusted key as a parting gift while more valuable things were taken was something she had seen before done to people worth far more than what was taken from them. She wrote, "Do not let them dress cruelty up as practicality. You know how to recognize that. I know you do, because I watched you at 18 and saw someone who read carefully enough to find what a text was hiding." She wrote about the house on the last page. She asked Harriet if she could to make it a reading room again. Not a monument, not an institution, just a room where someone who could not yet read could sit without shame. She wrote that if Harriet could not manage this, she understood completely, and she asked only one thing, that Harriet not sell it to someone whose only relationship with the people who had passed through it was to calculate what their absence was worth. The letter ended without a formal closing, just the name written in the same steady hand as the first word of the first entry in the first notebook. Mabel. Harriet sat with her palm flat on the last page. Roscoe had stepped out at some point while she was reading. She had not heard him go. She heard him now on the porch, his steps slow and deliberate, a man giving another person the room their reading required. The room was cold. The flashlight on the table had begun to dim slightly, the battery giving its first warning. Harriet did not move to adjust it. She sat with her hand on Mabel's name and let the cold and the quiet and the fading light be exactly what they were. She had come here thinking she was looking for a place to wait out a decision someone else was trying to force her to make. She understood now that Mabel had known half a century ahead of time that the decision Harriet would eventually face was not really about a house or a deed or a signature on a legal document. It was about whether Harriet Voss at 74 would understand the difference between the things that could be taken from her and the things that could not. The porch boards shifted under Roscoe's weight. He came back to the doorway. He asked if she was all right. Harriet said she was. She said she thought she understood now why Mabel had kept the cabinet locked. Roscoe said there had been people, over the years after Mabel passed, who had tried to access the house. Not forcibly, but persistently, the way certain kinds of persistence can feel like force. He said he had held them off using various combinations of the truth and the law's indifference to clearing something that was already titled to a private owner. Harriet said she was going to have to deal with the legal situation carefully. She said the paperwork from 2009 established her ownership in principle, but that principle and actuality were two different things when a developer had already presented false representations to a planning board. Roscoe said Leland Fitch was aware of this and had been managing the clock on the board's review. He said Harriet needed to appear in person before the board to correct the record. He said the next meeting was Tuesday. Harriet said she understood. She was gathering the notebooks back into the cabinet, carefully not replacing the lock, but closing the doors when she heard footsteps on the porch outside. Not Roscoe's footsteps. Someone else. A lighter tread. More than one set. She came to the doorway of the front room and looked toward the door which Roscoe had left standing open. A man appeared in this frame. He was in his early 50s, wearing a fleece jacket that had the particular brand of expensive that tries to look practical, and leather boots that had been treated against the weather but not made for actual outdoor work. He was carrying a manila folder under one arm, and he wore the expression of someone who had decided before entering a room how the conversation in that room was going to go. He saw Harriet standing in the interior of the house, and something crossed his face for a fraction of a second, something that was very close to surprise before the expression he had prepared reassembled itself. He said he was sorry to intrude. He said his name was Wade Prentice. He said he had heard from a mutual contact that Harriet Voss was in Graymill, and he had hoped they might be able to have a conversation about the property. Harriet looked at him across the room. She did not move toward the door. She said she knew who he was. Prentice said he was glad that it would save some time. He said he had driven out from Burlington specifically because he felt the situation had been handled at some distance and without the personal conversation it deserved. He said he wanted Harriet to know that the project he was proposing would treat the land well, that the environmental standards would be high, that the economic benefit to Graymill would be real and not hypothetical. He placed the manila folder on the windowsill nearest the door without being invited to enter. He said the terms inside were better than anything Fletcher had shown her, that he wanted Harriet to have the full picture. Roscoe Dunbar appeared from behind Harriet. He had come down from somewhere in the house without Harriet hearing him, and he stood in the doorway between the entry hall and the front room with his hands at his sides. He said Prentice's name. Prentice looked at Roscoe. Something shifted in his posture very slightly, a compression in the shoulders that the fleece jacket almost concealed. Roscoe said he remembered when Prentice was 14 years old and used to ride his bicycle past the construction site where Roscoe was framing the Osgood house on the Rutland Road. He said he remembered thinking the boy had good eyes for angles and proportions. He said he had been glad about that at the time. He said he was less glad about it now. Prentice said he respected Roscoe, but that this was a business matter between him and the property owner. Roscoe said he was aware of that. He said he was also aware that Prentice had told the planning board 3 months ago that the owner had agreed to sell and that he had used the name of her grandson to support that claim, and that neither of those things was true and that Prentice knew they were not true when he said them. The room was very quiet. Prentice said he may have moved ahead of the confirmed paperwork in a way that was in retrospect not ideal. Roscoe said the phrase he was looking for was not ideal. He let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he said something Harriet had not expected. He said he had helped build the development office building Prentice's company operated from. He had poured the foundation himself in 2003. He said it was a solid building and he had been proud of it. He said he wanted Prentice to leave now. Prentice looked at Harriet. Harriet said the offer was not something she was going to consider. She said she would appreciate it if he did not return to this property without a legal basis for doing so. Prentice took the manila folder from the windowsill. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the house the way a man looks at something he believes he should have by now and still does not. Then he left. Harriet and Roscoe stood in the front room without speaking for a moment. The sound of Prentice's vehicle on the gravel drive carried through the walls, and then there was nothing but the house and the lake and the fading light through the windows. Harriet looked at Roscoe. She said she needed to make a phone call to an attorney in Burlington in the morning to understand exactly where she stood on the documentation. She said she needed to be at the planning board meeting on Tuesday. She said she did not know yet what was going to be possible or what was going to require more time and more resources than she currently had access to. Roscoe said he knew a land records attorney in Burlington who had helped his family with a boundary dispute years back and who knew the Gray Mill Planning Board's procedures from previous cases. Harriet said she would appreciate that introduction. They were walking back toward the gate when Harriet's phone rang. She took it from her pocket. The number on the screen was one she knew without looking at the name attached to it. She had dialed it at and received calls from it more times than she had counted over 30 years. She stopped walking. She looked at the number for 2 rings, then 3. Roscoe stopped beside her and waited. It was Fletcher's number. And when she looked more carefully at the screen, she saw below the incoming call from Fletcher, a notification that had arrived 20 minutes ago while she was reading Mabel's letter, which she had not heard over the sound of her own concentration. The notification was a text message from Nora. It said only 4 words, but those 4 words rearranged everything Harriet thought she knew about how much time she had. It said, "We are in Vermont." Harriet did not answer Fletcher's call. She stood at the edge of the gravel drive with the phone in her hand and let it ring through to voicemail. And then she looked at Nora's text message again. "We are in Vermont," 4 words that told her Fletcher had made a decision about how this was going to go and had brought his sister along either as support or as evidence of family consensus, the way you bring a second signature to a document when you want to make the first one feel less like a demand. Roscoe had read her face when the phone stopped ringing. He said nothing. He walked back to the house and held the front door open and let Harriet decide for herself when to follow. She stood outside for another moment. The sky had gone fully dark by now, and the lake made no sound, the surface sealed under the cold, and the lights of the 2 or 3 occupied houses visible through the trees on the far bank were the only indication that this place was inhabited by anyone at all. She thought of the notebooks upstairs. She thought of the entries in Mabel's handwriting, names and dates, and small notations of progress, hundreds of them, across 40 years, none of them asking to be remembered, just asking to be continued. She went back inside. They arrived at 20 minutes past 7. Harriet heard the car on the drive before she heard the knock, and she was standing in the front room when Fletcher's voice came through the door. Not loud, controlled the voice of someone who had rehearsed the opening. He said her name. He asked if she was in there. Roscoe was seated in the corner of the room with a glass of water from the kitchen tap. He looked at Harriet. She crossed to the door and opened it. Fletcher was standing on the porch with his jacket open despite the cold. The same jacket he had worn to her kitchen table in Boston, the zipper still functioning but abandoned. Nora stood behind his right shoulder with both hands on the strap of her bag, and she was looking not at Harriet, but at the front of the house itself, taking in its dimensions and its age, with an expression that was not the expression of someone calculating square footage. Fletcher said he had been trying to reach her for 2 days. He said the whole family had been worried. He said Nora had barely slept. Harriet stepped back from the doorway and let them in. The house received them the way old houses receive new people, with the slight adjustment of atmosphere that comes from warmth entering cold air, from voices entering a silence that has settled into its own quality. Fletcher looked around the front room, the way he had looked around her kitchen in Boston, and then looked at Roscoe, who did not stand up. Fletcher asked who Roscoe was. Roscoe said his name without elaborating. Fletcher said he was sorry, but this was a private family matter. Roscoe said he had built the floor Fletcher was standing on and intended to stay where he was. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something that has been building has just reached its surface. Fletcher turned back to Harriet. He set a manila folder on the long table different from the blue folder from Boston. This one had a printed label on the cover. Harriet did not go to it. She asked Fletcher how he had known where she was. Fletcher said Prentice had called him that afternoon. He said Prentice had mentioned that Harriet was here and that she seemed to be under some kind of outside influence about the property and that a conversation between family members might help clarify things. Harriet said she understood. She asked Fletcher one more question. She asked whether, when Prentice called him, he had been surprised to hear that Prentice was in Gray Mill and had been at this house. Fletcher said Prentice had interests in the area. Harriet said that was not what she had asked. The silence that followed had weight to it. Nora looked at the floor. Roscoe looked at the window, which was dark, and gave back nothing. Fletcher said the situation had gotten more complicated than he had intended. He said he had made contact with Prentice 8 months ago because he had been looking for solutions and Prentice's project looked like one. He said he had come to Gray Mill in September before the Boston conversation to understand what the property was, and that while he was here, he had spoken with a member of the planning board about the general parameters of the project. Harriet said the general parameters. She repeated the phrase without emphasis. He said he had not represented himself as having legal authority he did not have. He said he had been exploring options. Harriet said the planning board had written down the name Fletcher Voss and the phrase owner's representative next to a project proposal that had been presented as having the family's agreement in principle. Fletcher said he had perhaps let the conversation go further than it should have without correcting a misunderstanding about his role. Nora said Fletcher's name. He looked at her. She said she needed to say something, and she was going to say it regardless of whether it was what he wanted her to say in this particular room. She spoke to Harriet. She said she had known about Fletcher's trip to Gray Mill in September. She had not known all the details, but she had known he came here and that it was connected to Prentice. She had known more than she had told Harriet in Boston, and the reason she had not told her was the same reason she had not told her things before, which was that she had believed wrongly and repeatedly that the cost of the silence was smaller than the waste of the confrontation. She said she had been wrong about that every time. She said she understood if Harriet needed time before she could decide what to do with that admission. Fletcher looked at his sister with the expression of someone watching a structure he trusted shift under its own weight. He did not speak. Harriet looked at Nora for a long moment. She thought of the girl who had stood in her kitchen in Boston and said almost the same thing, the same admission in different words. And she thought about what it meant that Nora kept arriving at the truth through a door she had to be pushed toward. It was not malice. It had never been malice. But the pattern of it, the repetition of choosing quiet over honest, had its own kind of cost, and Harriet had been paying portions of that cost for years without naming it clearly. She said to Nora that she heard her. She said they would talk more about it in time. Then she looked at Fletcher. She said she wanted to be accurate about what she was doing and what she was not doing. She was not punishing him. She was not settling a score. She had spent enough years in classrooms to know that punishment rarely taught what you hoped it would teach. What she was doing was simpler than that. She was making a decision about something that was hers to decide, and she was making it on the basis of what she had found in this house over the past 2 days, and the decision was that she was not going to sell. Fletcher said there were financial consequences that she might not be fully accounting for. She said she was accounting for all of it. He said she could not realistically maintain this property at her age on her income without the kind of support that required family agreement and coordination. She said she appreciated his concern for the practicalities. She said she had already identified people in Gray Mill who were willing to help with the property in ways that did not require a sale. Roscoe did not move from his chair, but something in the way he was sitting changed very slightly, a small straightening. Fletcher said those were strangers. Harriet said they were people who had known this house and what it represented for longer than Fletcher had been alive. She said that was not nothing. Fletcher looked at the folder on the table. He looked at the cabinet visible through the doorway of the workroom, its doors still closed. He looked around the front room at the empty shelves and the stone fireplace, and the dusty floors and the windows that let in no light at this hour. She could see him trying to find the argument that would change what he was looking at, the angle from which the house became simply an asset with a price and a timeline rather than a place with a history and a claimant. He did not find it. He said fine. He said she was making a mistake, but that it was hers to make. He picked up the manila folder. He said she knew where he was if something changed. He walked to the door. He opened it and the cold came in and he stepped through. Nora did not move for a moment. She stood in the middle of the room looking at Harriet with an expression that was something Harriet had not seen on her granddaughter's face in a very long time. It was the expression of someone who has finally done the thing they knew they should have done earlier and is standing on the other side of it for the first time, not knowing yet what that ground feels like under their feet. She said she would come back. She said she meant it. Harriet said she knew she did. Nora went to the door. At the threshold, she stopped without turning around. She said there was something in her bag she had brought from Boston, not because she knew why she was bringing it, just because it felt like it belonged somewhere other than a storage box in her spare room. She put her bag down on the porch and reached into it and brought out a plastic grocery bag that held several thin notebooks, the kind sold for school use, narrow-ruled with soft cardboard covers. She said they were Harriet's. She said she had found them years ago in a box from when she and Fletcher were in middle school, and she had kept them without knowing why, and now she thought she understood why, and she was bringing them back. She set the bag inside the door and left. Harriet picked up the bag after a moment and looked inside. Composition notebooks, the kind she had used to grade student work in the 90s. Inside the top one, in her own handwriting, a name she recognized as a student from 1994, and beside it in red ink, a note she had written 30 years ago. Try again. I know you can. She stood there holding the notebook for a long time. Roscoe said from his chair that she should sit down and eat something if she was going to be at the town hall at 9 the next morning and need her full faculties. Harriet looked up. She said she did not have anything to eat in the house. Roscoe said he had brought 2 sandwiches from the general store on his way over. He said he had suspected the evening was going to be long. She sat down at the table. He brought the sandwiches from a paper bag he had left in the kitchen, and they ate in the kind of quiet that does not require filling. The planning board met in the town hall on Tuesday morning. The building was one Roscoe had noted on the way, in a low structure on the main road with wide front steps and double doors, and the particular institutional solidity of a place that has been making decisions for a long time. Harriet arrived at 8:45 with Ida Hale, who had offered to come without being asked and who carried a canvas tote bag containing several folders of her own. Leland Fitch was already inside, standing near the front of the room, speaking with a woman Harriet did not recognize, who turned out to be the board's recording secretary. Leland nodded when Harriet came in. He did not make a production of the greeting. He simply nodded the way people nod when something they have been waiting for has arrived on schedule. Wade Prentice was seated in the second row on the left side. He had a colleague with him, a younger man with a laptop and a presentation folder open on the seat beside him. When Harriet came in, he looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing his position without wanting anyone to notice he was doing it. The room held perhaps 40 people. Harriet had not expected this many. She had thought of the meeting as procedural, a legal step in a longer process. But the people seated on the wooden chairs and standing at the back were not there for procedure. She recognized a few faces from her days in the village: Leland's sister, who ran the feed store, the woman from the general store who had sold Roscoe the sandwiches the night before, an older man whose face she could not place, but who looked at her with an expression of recognition that she had not earned in the days she had been here. Ida leaned toward her and said quietly that word had traveled. The way word traveled in small towns, not through any particular announcement, but through the accumulated attention of people who knew each other and knew what was at stake. Leland called the meeting to order at 9 o'clock. He described the agenda item. The Prentice and Partners proposal for the Mill Pond waterfront development had been pending board review since September. The review had been postponed pending documentation of ownership and authorization for the parcel at 14 Mill Pond Road. The documentation question had now been resolved by the appearance of the actual property owner. He invited Harriet to address the board. Harriet stood up. She was wearing the same coat she had worn on the bus from Boston, which had not been designed for formal appearances and did not pretend otherwise. She had her reading glasses in her coat pocket and her bag on the floor beside her chair. She had not prepared remarks because she had found in 41 years of speaking to rooms full of people that prepared remarks were best when you were telling people something they did not already know. And what she had to say this morning was something she believed this room already knew and simply needed someone to say aloud. She said her name. She said she was the owner of the property at 14 Mill Pond Road by inheritance from Mabel Oaks, whose name some people in this room might recognize. She said she had not authorized any representative to speak on her behalf at any prior board meeting or in any prior communication with the board or with Prentice and Partners. She said this clearly and without emphasis because a clear statement did not require emphasis. She said she was not selling the property. She said she intended to restore it to the use Mabel Oaks had made of it for 4 decades as a community reading and literacy space operated informally and without charge for anyone in Graymill and the surrounding area who needed it. She said she understood this was not a development proposal and therefore did not require the board's approval. But she was stating her intentions publicly so that the record was clear and so that any future representations made by any party about the status of this property could be evaluated against what she was saying now. She sat down. Prentice stood immediately. He said he appreciated Ms. Voss's clarity and respected her wishes regarding her own property. He said, however, that the broader Mill Pond development project had secured commitments from other landowners along the frontage, and that the project's viability and those other landowners' commitments were contingent on the full assembly. He said he hoped the board would recognize the economic impact of the project for Graymill and weigh that in his considerations of the remaining public access components of the waterfront. Leland said the board had heard Mr. Prentice's position and would address the public access questions separately in due course. Then Roscoe Dunbar stood up. He did not raise his hand. He did not wait to be recognized by Leland, though Leland looked at him when he rose and did not ask him to sit down. He simply stood, the deliberate rising of a man whose body requires negotiation with gravity now, and when he was upright, the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with anyone calling for order. He said his name. He said he had lived in Gray Mill his whole life and had built most of what was standing in it. He said he wanted to say one thing and then he would sit down. He said in 1971 he went to the house at 14 Mill Pond Road because he could not read a legal paragraph, and his livelihood depended on being able to. He said Mabel Oakes spent 8 months teaching him. He said she had never told a soul, had never asked for anything, had simply opened her door 3 evenings a week and waited for him to show up. He said he had signed his name to 47 building contracts after that. He said every structure he had built in this town, including the floor of this room, had been built by a man who could read what he was signing. He said Mr. Prentice was a capable developer and had done capable work in other parts of Vermont, but he said Mr. Prentice was proposing to replace something that could not be rebuilt with something that could be built anywhere. And he said the people in Gray Mill who had passed through that house deserved to have someone say that in a room with a record. He sat down. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Leland gently tapped the table in front of him and said the board would take a brief recess. During the recess, Harriet stood near the back wall and watched the room. Several people came to speak to her briefly, the way people speak at a gathering when they want to convey something and do not have enough time or privacy to say it fully. The man she had not recognized earlier came and stood in front of her and said he was the son of a woman named Agnes, who had attended Mabel's sessions in the early 60s. He said his mother had died in 1998 and had spent the last years of her life writing letters to her grandchildren, and that they still had the letters. He said he was glad somebody was going to look after the house. Prentice left during the recess. He did not speak to Harriet. He took his folder and his colleague and walked out with the particular efficiency of someone who has reclassified a situation as no longer worth his direct attention. Harriet watched him go and felt nothing that resembled triumph, only a clarifying of something that had been obscured the way weather changes, and the thing that was always there becomes visible. When the board reconvened, Leland announced that the Prentice and Partners application for the Mill Pond waterfront development was withdrawn from consideration pending the applicant's reassessment of the site assembly. He said the board would continue to review the public access components of the waterfront in a separate proceeding. He thanked everyone for attending and closed the meeting. Ida walked out beside Harriet into the cold air. She said she had attended a great many planning board meetings over the years and that this one would be discussed for a while. Harriet said she was sorry for any disruption. Ida said she had not said it was a bad thing. The days that followed had a different quality than the days before. Harriet was not certain yet what was going to be possible, what the legal process would require, how long it would take, or what it would cost. She had 2 phone calls with the land records attorney Roscoe had recommended, and the conversations were factual and procedural and left her with a clear understanding of the road ahead, which was neither short nor simple, but was also not closed. She stayed in the house sleeping in a borrowed cot Ida had quietly produced from the library's back storage, the small space heater in the workroom keeping the cold manageable. She was going through the manila folders from the lower shelf of the cabinet on a Thursday afternoon when Nell Farrow appeared at the door. Nell Farrow was 32 years old and taught at the Gray Mill Elementary School and had the particular energy of someone whose mind moved faster than most situations required, which she managed by writing things down constantly in a small notebook she kept in her shirt pocket. She had been sent, she said, by Ida, who had mentioned to her that the house was being considered for a community literacy purpose, and she had come to offer whatever assistance she could provide. Harriet asked her to sit down. Nell sat and opened her notebook and said she had some thoughts, if Harriet was open to hearing them, about what a reading and literacy space could look like practically given the resources available in Gray Mill and the specific gaps she had observed in her 3 years teaching in the area. Harriet said she was open to hearing them. Nell's plan was not ambitious in the way that plans become ambitious when someone wants to impress. It was practical, rooted in what already existed, priced against what was actually available. 3 shelves in the front room, a table with 6 chairs, a posted schedule with 3 regular sessions per week, 1 for children on Saturday mornings, and 2 open sessions for adults on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. No registration, no fee, no formal evaluation of any kind. She said there were 4 families in town with parents who read at a limited level and who did not go to the library because the library, however welcoming Ida made, it was still a public institution with a public register and a public record, and some people needed a door that felt less official. Harriet listened to all of this without interrupting. When Nell finished, she said she thought it was the right scale. She said starting small was not the same as thinking small. Nell said that was exactly how she had been trying to explain it to the school principal for 2 years and had not managed to do it that cleanly. Roscoe agreed to do the shelving and any structural repairs the front room needed before it could safely hold people on a regular basis. He spent 4 days on it, working in the mornings when the light was best, and Harriet worked around him cleaning and sorting and making decisions about what stayed and what went. It was companionable work, the kind that does not require conversation because both people understand what they are doing and why. On the second day he was there, while Harriet was going through the last of the manila folders from the cabinet, she found a single photograph tucked into the back of the bottom folder. A black and white image, slightly faded, showing a room that she recognized after a moment as the front room of the house in an earlier decade. At a long table similar to the one still there, 4 people were seated. 3 of them were facing slightly away from the camera, their faces obscured. The 4th was looking directly at the lens with the expression of someone who had been told to smile and had decided that a direct look was a more honest response. It was Mabel. Younger than Harriet had ever seen her, perhaps 50, perhaps 55, with the same quality of attention in her face that Harriet remembered from 1970, the kind of attention that made you feel that the thing you were saying was being genuinely received. Harriet set the photograph on top of the cabinet. She looked at it from across the room for a while, then she went back to work. Nora came on a Friday alone in her own car. She knocked at the gate before entering, which Harriet heard from inside and which told her something had changed in how Nora understood whose house this was. They sat at the table in the workroom with 2 cups of tea made from bags Nell had left in the kitchen during one of her earlier visits. Nora did not begin with an explanation or an apology. She began by asking about the notebooks, the ones Mabel had kept, and Harriet told her about them, about the entries and the names and the particular quality of attention Mabel had brought to the record of her own work. Nora said she had been thinking about the night in Boston, about the kitchen table and the pen. She said she had thought about it a great deal since Vermont, and what she kept coming back to was not the specific things she had known and not said, which she had already acknowledged, but the longer pattern behind them, which was that she had spent most of her adult life making herself useful to whatever situation she was in, rather than honest about it, and that she had mistaken those 2 things for the same thing for too long. Harriet said that was a significant thing to understand about yourself. Nora said it was easier to understand than to change. She said she was not going to pretend she had changed by virtue of understanding it. Harriet said that was the most accurate thing Nora had said to her in several years, and that accuracy was a reasonable place to start. They sat with that for a moment. Then Harriet asked her about Fletcher. Nora said he had not called her since Graymill. She said she thought he needed time to be in the difficulty of his situation without someone else managing it for him, and she was trying to let that happen without stepping in. She said it was harder than it sounded. Harriet said she knew. She did not hear from Fletcher for 2 weeks. Then the evening before the opening, she found an envelope tucked between the iron bars of the front gate when she went out to check the latch before dark. The envelope had her name on it in Fletcher's handwriting. She opened it, standing at the gate in the cold. Inside was not a letter. It was a photograph printed from a phone onto standard printer paper, the image slightly pixelated from the enlargement. The photograph showed a kitchen, Harriet's kitchen on Sedgwick Street in Boston. The angle was low, close to table height, the angle of someone standing at the edge of the table or sitting at it as a child would sit. The table surface was visible in the foreground, the familiar pale maple with a small repaired crack along the left edge. In the background, slightly out of focus, the wall with the refrigerator and the poem on the small piece of paper held up by the Massachusetts magnet. She had not noticed when she left the apartment that the poem was still on the refrigerator. She had not thought about it. But Fletcher, at some point in the days after she left, had stood in that kitchen and taken this photograph at a child's angle, the angle of a boy who had eaten breakfast at that table for years and had printed it and driven to Graymill and placed it at her gate without knocking or waiting or asking for anything in return. On the back of the photograph in blue ink, he had written, "This is what I remember most. I am sorry it took me this long to understand what I was asking you to give up. Harriet stood at the gate for a long time. The lake was invisible in the dark, but she could hear a faint movement of water against the frozen edge of the bank. The sound of something continuing to move because that was its nature, regardless of the temperature. She folded the photograph and put it inside her coat against her chest, and she went back inside. The morning of the opening was clear and cold. The particular cold of Vermont in December that has no moisture in it that makes the air transparent. Harriet had been awake before light. She had made coffee on the small camp stove and drunk it standing at the workroom window, watching the sky change from black to dark blue to the gray that preceded color. Roscoe arrived first before anyone else at 7 in the morning. He did not knock. He let himself through the gate which Harriet had left unlatched the night before, and he came up the porch steps and opened the front door and looked at the front room. The 3 shelves were up. The long table was clean, the chairs set evenly around it. On each chair was a new composition notebook and a sharpened pencil. Nell had placed them there the night before, moving around the room with her own notebook open in her hand, arranging things with the careful attention of someone setting up for work that mattered. Roscoe looked at the shelves. They were his work. He looked at them the way craftsmen look at finished work, not with pride exactly, more with the assessment of someone confirming that a thing is what it was meant to be. Harriet said good morning. He said good morning. He said the shelves were level. She said she knew. He took off his jacket and hung it on one of the hooks she had installed near the door, and sat down in the chair at the far end of the table and poured himself coffee from the thermos she had set out. Ida arrived at 8 with a box of books from the library's donation stock hardcovers in paperbacks in reasonable condition, arranged by subject in a system only Ida fully understood, which she transferred to the shelves with a speed and accuracy that suggested she had planned the placement on the walk over. She also brought a cast iron pot of soup, which she set on the camp stove with the instruction that it was for later and not to let anyone touch it before noon. Nell arrived at 8:30 with a hand-painted sign that she had made herself, plywood cut to size, and painted a clean white with letters in dark blue Mill Pond Reading Room. She held it up and asked where Harriet wanted it. Harriet looked at the sign. She said above the door of the front room. Nell got a chair and a hammer and hung it there. People came at 9. Not a crowd, not a ceremony. The children came first, 3 of them initially, then 2 more arriving in the particular cautious way that children arrive at a place they have been told is for them, but are not yet certain is safe. Nell sat with them at the table and opened a picture book and read the first page in her ordinary voice, not a reading aloud voice, just her voice, and the children leaned in. The adults came more slowly. The man whose mother had been Agnes arrived with a woman Harriet did not know, and they sat together near the window. An older couple came in, and the woman went directly to the shelves and began reading the spines. A man in his late 60s came alone and stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, and he did not sit, but he stayed standing near the back wall with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the room. At 9:30, Roscoe Dunbar stood up from his chair at the end of the table. He walked to the door and looked out through it. Harriet, who was speaking quietly with Ida near the shelves, watched him from across the room. He stood at the door for a moment, looking at the gate. The iron was exactly as it had been, the rust and the old vine stems and the weathering of decades unchanged. Nell had asked whether they should paint it, and Harriet had said to leave it. Roscoe had not weighed in at the time, but now standing at the door, he nodded once to himself with the expression of someone who recognizes a decision made on the right basis. He turned back into the room. Nell looked at Harriet and asked quietly if she would read something. Harriet looked at this table. The children were there, and the adults who had come in, and Roscoe back in his chair at the far end, and Ida making a show of counting books on a shelf while actually watching everything in the room. Through the window beside the shelves, the gate was visible in the morning light, rusted and open. Harriet went to her bag and took out the book. The one she had carried from Boston on the bus, whose spine she had repaired twice, whose margins held her own thoughts in pencil from across 4 decades. The book Mabel had lent to a frustrated 18-year-old in the summer of 1970, and that the 18-year-old had carried forward into a life she had not yet known she was going to live. She sat down at the table. She opened the book to the first page. Her voice, when it came, was unsteady for the first few words. Not from weakness, from the accumulated weight of everything that had brought her to this chair in this room on this particular morning, the kitchen table in Boston, and the pen in the drawer, and the bus, and the gate, and the cabinet, and the letter, and the words of a woman who had died in 2009, believing that the right person might eventually come. Harriet let the unsteadiness be there without trying to correct it. It was honest, and honesty was the only quality she had ever really required of herself in a room where people were listening. Then the voice settled. It settled into the voice she had used for 41 years in classrooms, the voice that did not perform and did not instruct, but simply brought the words forward and set them down in the air between her and whoever was listening, with enough care that the words had a chance to be what they were. The children stopped moving. The man standing at the back wall let his hands fall to his sides. Roscoe looked at the table surface in front of him with the focused stillness of someone listening with their whole body. Harriet read. She read slowly, not because the book required it, but because this room deserved it, and because somewhere between Boston and Graymill, and a locked cabinet, and a letter from a woman she had not thought about in 50 years, she had remembered something she had known since she was 18, and said aloud to students 1,000 times, and somehow lost sight of along the way. You do not rush toward the ending. The ending will arrive on its own. What matters is that you understood the road. Outside through the window, the iron gate stood in the December light, unpainted and open. The rust on it was the color of old work of things built and maintained and handed forward. It was the color of a key that had been waiting in a drawer for 15 years for the right person to need it. Harriet turned the page. She kept reading.